everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started. We are running a little bit behind, but I'm sure we'll catch up, or we won't. But we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then Emily or Dawn, whichever one of you wants to share your screen, and Jamie, take it away.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jessica. So right now we have Migrating 6,000 Finding Aids to Archy, a glow-up story. Emily Brassell, she, her pronouns, is Associate Head of Software Development at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill Libraries. She served as the project manager for the ArchivesSpace migration project and is now hooked on archives. We'd love to hear that. Dawne Lucas, also she, her pronouns, is the Technical Services Archivist for Collection Management at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill Libraries. She led several data cleanup projects to ensure that the finding aids would ingest into ArchivesSpace. Emily and Dawne will give an overview of UNC Libraries' ArchivesSpace migration, a complex multi-year project that included the migration of around 6,100 finding aids. My goodness. They will discuss approaches to the various challenges encountered and reflections on the process now that migration is complete. They will also discuss the selection and implementation of Arclight as the public user interface and describe the tools UNC built to manage digital object integration and the publication of ArchivesSpace data into Arclight. Thanks. Go ahead, guys.
Thanks. Thanks so much for having us. I'm Emily, and I'm here with Dawne. And yeah, we're going to tell you about our big migration story, which right now I'm feeling very grateful that we didn't have to migrate data from many different campuses and that we didn't have twice as many finding aids. But nonetheless, it took us around 6 years to do this migration project. But we wanted to start by thanking everybody who worked on the project, which was quite a few people. We had many stakeholders from across the libraries who were very involved. And also to say a thank you to the community. We had a lot of help from peer institutions who provided support and code and guidance, and we're very grateful for that. So I'm going to flash forward to today, just so that you know that this story does have a happy ending. So this is our kind of ArchivesSpace ecosystem today. All of our data is safely into ArchivesSpace. We have the Digital Object Manager plugin, Domino, that can receive data from a digital repository and create and delete and manage digital objects based on that data. We have our publishing tool, Pipette, that saves a copy of EAD into version control in GitLab, and also publishes a copy of EAD into our public interface, into Arclight, and into our flavor of Arclight, which is called Archy for Arclight at Chapel Hill. But back in 2019, the road ahead was not clear and was confusing. We knew we had to migrate data from 3 different sources. We had over 6,100 finding aids stored as EAD in a Git repo. And at the time, we were just transforming those into HTML for display on the web. We had this old rickety Access database that we were worried could break down anytime. And that's where we had our physical locations data, as well as some supplemental data in an Excel spreadsheet. And then we had our accession records and archivist toolkit. And to make things even more complicated, another big migration was being planned at our library, and that was the migration of all of our digital content out of Content DM and into the digital collections repository, which is software that we built in-house on top of Fedora. So these 2 big migrations were interwoven, and there were a lot of sort of chicken and egg questions of like, what order should we do this in? Especially knowing that the Content DM migration was going to happen 1 collection at a time, whereas ours was sort of all or nothing, all the EAD at once. You can see that we had challenges. The scope of the migration, as was mentioned before, a project of this size needs to be broken down into sub-projects. We had the data from multiple sources and the EAD from more than 25 years and many authors that need to be normalized. We had the complexity of integrating with other systems. And then any migration like this gives you the opportunity to handle all kinds of other related issues that surface. Like when you're making this many technical decisions, you run across things that have been kind of swept under the rug for a while. And so we had the chance to deal with those. This was also a project that required collaboration from many staff across the libraries, but we didn't have any staff who were solely dedicated to the migration. So the amount that we were able to participate kind of waxed and waned over time. We couldn't always be fully focused on the project. And then the pandemic brought us the same challenges that I'm sure it brought all of you. Although it also brought some opportunities for some folks to concentrate on some remediation projects that would have been in the background had we been in person. So to talk about how we handled some of these challenges, I want to start with collaboration because that really has been the cornerstone of the project. When we've had good communication, and then we've been able to really move the project forward. So our collaboration methods have really evolved over the course of the project. In the beginning, in the before times, we were all in person. Now, many of the team works fully remotely. So most of our collaboration is online. We use team sites to share documentation. And we are using an agile-ish approach to project management. We have monthly sprint planning meetings, and we track our work with tickets in Jira. Many of us attended an Agile training to learn more about the different roles in Agile, particularly about the product owner role, because we really wanted a product owner for Archy, for our Arclight public interface, to streamline some of those decisions. So we divided the project into a number of sub-projects or project tracks, and then divided each of those into multiple milestones. And so in Jira, we were able to create epics based on the different project tracks and assign epics or milestones to those epics, and then assign Jira tickets to those milestones. And some of these tracks were overlapping, those last three, and then some were a little bit more contained. We kicked off the project officially in April 2019, but we'd already spent a lot of time doing some planning and technical research. And we launched only a few weeks ago on March 4th. So this is all quite fresh, and we will, we're learning as we go. Our game plan was not clear in the beginning. We weren't sure which order we wanted to do the migrations. We wanted to have resource records in ArchivesSpace so that we could attach all of the other records to them, but we didn't want to start with the EAD migration because it would be the most complex and the lengthiest. So ultimately, we decided to start with Archivist Toolkit because that was the clearest migration path. There were built-in tools plugins that we could use. And so we migrated our accessions data in fall of 2019. And from that, we created placeholder resource records. So just some skeleton resource records without any hierarchy, just enough to attach other records to. And then we migrated our physical locations data and put that access database to bed, which was a relief. And it was almost a year later in May 2021 before we could finish the physical locations migration because we had to get back on campus to do some physical reshelving projects. And then finally, our EAD migration was just finalized in January of this year. But we were working on it for a long time before that. There were several distinct phases. After that technical research and planning, there was this gray circle, which is a kind of feedback loop for software development and for special collections tech services to identify and categorize the different kinds of errors that were preventing EAD from being ingested into ArchivesSpace. And we're grateful to Harvard for their tools that we took advantage of for some of this work. And Dawne's going to talk a little bit more about that. And once we had all the EAD as close to being able to ingest as possible, we entered a sort of holding pattern where we concentrated on other aspects of the project, but we still generated weekly reports that would bring up any errors that might have crept into the EAD to make it incompatible with ingest. And then finally, we started a launch sequence in October 2024, and that started a content freeze on our archival description and allowed us to do a final test ingest onto our QA instance and then do some really thorough QA work over the course of several weeks to look at everything, all the data in ArchivesSpace, and test out our publication tools and look at the data in Arclight, and then to do a final ingest onto our production instance before launch. And I'll let Dawne talk a little bit about the data cleanup.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. So as Emily already mentioned, technical services needed to do a lot of data cleanup before we could ingest the finding aids into ArchivesSpace. Container matching was the biggest cleanup component. The goal was for container information in the finding aids and the container information that we had imported into ArchivesSpace from the Access database to match. I'll talk a little more about that in a minute. The majority of the other errors in the finding aids were resolved upon ingest with various automated scripts. So thank you to software development for that. But there were some errors that could not easily be resolved with a script, either because they didn't follow a predictable pattern, there was just too much going on, or there just weren't enough examples to take up software development's time to write a script to do it. So you could see examples of some of the things that we went in and cleaned up manually. I have extent cleanup that actually, a lot of that was cleaned up with a script, but we had some wild extents that just wasn't going to be accommodated with a script. So as Emily mentioned, we did receive weekly error reports. We actually, I believe, started getting them in January 2021 and received them all the way up until October 2024 when we froze the EAD finding aids and weren't updating them anymore. And actually, these reports were so baked into our workflows that we kind of missed receiving them once they were no longer necessary. Next slide. So container matching, here's a really straightforward container matching example. So again, we needed to make sure that the information in ArchivesSpace matched what was in the finding aids. So this is a really basic example. You'll see in the top, on the top, there was a folder 1 in the finding aid. So that means there also needs to be a folder 1 on the resource record. And you can see that it is there as a child of SHC Z box 1. So you might think that this would be pretty straightforward, but a lot of the errors were more complicated to fix than this one. There were tens of thousands of errors that needed to be fixed, so it took a long time. We had a year-long project, it was actually a little bit more than a year, to correct these inconsistencies. And as I already mentioned, we had a weekly report that ran, so we knew what still needed to be cleaned up. And I will turn it back to Emily now.
We use to link digital content to archival description. Those IDs are based on container type and container number, but they get really complex and they were problematic in our old system. So we spent a lot of time strategizing about how best to do linking with digital content. We wrote a detailed request for comments, or RFC, that we used as a decision-making tool so folks could comment on that and we could have documentation of our decision-making. And ultimately, we had a day-long in-person planning retreat, or linking retreat, just to work out some of these issues. And we ended up with 12 outcomes. And one of them was that we would move away from linking based on physical containers and move towards linking based on intellectual arrangement. So instead of using these container-based IDs, we would use the ref IDs that ArchivesSpace automatically generates for archival objects. And that freed us up to start working on our digital object pipeline. So we developed Domino, the digital object manager plugin. And this gray circle is our current pipeline to get the IDs that are based on the containers. But Domino is set up that it could receive data from a number of sources. Currently this is our content DM pipeline, and in the future we'll be getting data from the digital collections repository. And Domino receives that data nightly, and then each night it creates new digital objects as needed. It deletes digital objects that are no longer needed, and it links and unlinks them as appropriate to archival objects. And we're pretty soon probably going to work on some more editing capabilities. Right now, it doesn't really update digital objects, but that's next on our list. We also were faced with selecting a public interface. So back in 2021, you might remember that the ArchivesSpace PUI was in a different iteration than it is now. So that had some impact on our decision-making. But back in 2021, we had a large group, the Finding Aids Public Interface Group, that had representation of a lot of different stakeholders from different areas: research and instructional services, the collecting areas, user experience, software development, special collections tech services. And we compiled a list of 58 functional requirements for the public interface. And then we prioritized 30 of those requirements as minimum viable product, MVP, things that we had to launch with. And with those requirements and then the criteria that you see on the slide, we evaluated Arclight and the public user interface and decided that Arclight would be the best fit for us for a number of reasons. One thing was that we already used Blacklight for a couple of other applications, and so we had in-house expertise. We also liked the idea of consistency with Duke, since we have shared patrons, and Duke has been very helpful to us throughout this process. And we like the way that it handled digital content. But two of the main reasons were discussed earlier, and those were the requirements that archivists be able to maintain control of publishing content to the public interface. Our archivists work on some extensive redescription projects, and rather than have those changes be published incrementally, we wanted them to be able to be published in a batch at the end of the project. And we also didn't want to give up our ability to maintain a record of changes to EAD. We wanted to keep a copy of it in a Git repo. So we knew that by selecting Arclight, we would give ourselves the opportunity to build a publishing pipeline that would meet those requirements. But there were some pretty big trade-offs. We knew we would have a significantly longer path to launch. We were going to have to customize Arclight, Aon integration, as mentioned earlier, being the main thing. And we were going to have to build this publishing pipeline. We also had some sustainability questions about the maturity of the software, because at this point it was only at version 0.4, and the fact that it had a small user community. But since then, the user community came together in some community sprints, where Arclight is past 1.0 now, and I think there's a 2.0 alpha. So some of those concerns have been alleviated. So once we selected our Arclight, we began the development and design of Archy, Arclight at Chapel Hill. Our initial customizations were on top of Duke's flavor of Arclight 0.4, but when Arclight 1.0 was due to come out, we actually started over with Arclight 1.0, so that's another thing that took a little while. And then we were able to pull together the same design team that had recently done a redesign of our library website, so user experience and a graphic designer and software development. And user experience did an extensive accessibility review for us and did some user testing that identified a few concrete things that we could fix and a few things that we couldn't really fix, but it was helpful to be aware of. And then our graphic designer provided some designs that matched our library website. One thing that we've tried to do, as other institutions have, is really highlight the digital content in Archy. Right now, we just have thumbnails that link out to the digital repository, but in the future, once we migrate to the DCR, we'll have an integrated viewer that'll look something like this. We also have added a request shopping cart. So this is based on Princeton's code. We're grateful to Princeton. So it allows you to select multiple archival objects, add them to your shopping cart, and then you can make requests for the top containers associated with those archival objects. And it will also dedupe requests for the same top container. And Dawn's going to tell us about Pipette.
Yeah, so Kyle Rimkus, this is following up on one of your questions from earlier. So we are using a locally developed Rails app called Pipette to preview and publish finding aids in Arclight, whereas technical services staff members will usually be the only ones to use the preview function. Other staff members can be invited to look at finding aids to give feedback before content goes live. So you'll see you have the preview path and the publication path. So one is staff preview and one is for everyone to see. For a resource record to be published on either of these paths, the collection level publish checkbox must be checked. We require that classification be linked to it because that's what we use to identify and facet our collecting units, such as the Southern Historical Collection or University Archives. For production, the finding aid status must be set to completed. For the staff preview, it must be set to either in progress or under revision. That last thing I said about the finding aid status field is actually based on decisions made during a meeting that we held yesterday in between session A and session B of this forum. I actually don't think the functionality has been implemented yet since it's so soon. And unless they are in attendance and hearing it right now, most of my department doesn't know that that's part of the workflow yet. So as you can see, we're still ironing some things out. Next slide. And here's a screenshot of the Pipette dashboard. So any resource record that has recently been updated and meets those requirements that I just mentioned appear in the Pipette queue. There are separate dashboards for production and staff preview, but the dashboards look the same. And nothing in the queue will be indexed onto production unless there's a corresponding ticket with instructions to index, and that prevents works in progress from accidentally being published. Three things happen when you select a resource record for indexing. The EAD is downloaded from ArchivesSpace. It's then indexed into Arclight, and a PDF is created. And this works pretty smoothly about 99% of the time. Some larger finding aids can be a little problematic, but it works for the most part. And I'll turn it back over to Emily.
So it's early days yet, and we've only been live for a few weeks, and I think we'll have more reflections in the future. But at this point, I think some of the major themes are the kind of the same lessons that I learned with every project, maybe get a little bit better each time. And then the first is that the collaboration and project management are worth spending significant time on. The core team that met weekly, we really could drive the project forward once we all were able to devote enough time to meet weekly and keep the conversation going. The second one is that the perfect is the enemy of the good. We had to make a lot of strategic decisions, and each one felt like it was going to have implications on our work for years to come, and each one had a downside. But I think once we were able to just make a decision and move ahead, that helped a lot. And at a certain point also, we had to really fight scope creep. There were so many things that we could have done as part of this project. At a certain point, we just had to be really disciplined about focusing on the MVP tasks and putting things in the backlog and saying, okay, we're just going to do what we have to do for launch. And then the third thing is just remembering how important change management is in migration, making sure that we repeated our message enough so that people understood what was coming. And I think also it's hard to get real feedback on a new interface until after you launch. Even doing some user testing and inviting staff to look at the interface and having a short beta launch, we really didn't get a lot of useful feedback until folks were really using the new system in production. And so in hindsight, we maybe could have done a little bit less tinkering before launch, knowing that we would not be getting the real useful feedback until after launch. So we have a number of next steps in our backlog, but rather than talk through those, I think we'll just leave time for questions. And also just to say that we would be happy to have more extensive conversations in the future with anybody who would be curious in hearing any more about any part of this migration. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Emily, and thank you, Dawne. We do have some questions in the Q&A. So we'll spend maybe a minute or two on questions, and then if you want to answer the rest in the chat, I'm going to the first questions I'm going to ask as a group. So is Domino available online? And then for both Domino and Pipette, are these tools the sorts of tools that other institutions could use in their instances of ArchivesSpace, or is it too specific to your way of doing things?
Right now, they're both just in private Git repos, but we could make both of them available on GitHub for folks to look at. And I think both of them would need a bit of customization. I think there's potential for other folks to use them, but they're not ready to use out of the box. They are customized to our instance at this point.
Thanks. Yeah. If you ever want to make them available, I know at least Kyle is interested, and many other people would be too. Sarah asked, when making a decision that was good enough, not perfect, did you document what the perfect solution would have been, or the anticipated consequences of not going with the perfect solution?
I don't think we were always that disciplined about it. We've been very careful about keeping good notes of our meetings and documenting the different options and why we chose the option we did. But I don't think there were many cases where we could see a perfect option. There were usually a series of flawed options. Yeah.
Yeah, that is kind of the problem, right? There's no perfect solution. And getting hung up on it can be a problem. Since we are at time, we're going to go ahead and move on. But thank you both so much. And I want to thank you both, but UNC, you've been so great about doing the presentations throughout forums. If you're a longtime forum viewer, I feel like we've been along for this journey with you, and it's so exciting to see how things are happening. And I love seeing how you're using resources from other institutions and building on like community generated resources that already exist to do this work. So I think this is really great. And I look forward to seeing you at another forum. I already anticipate it. So thank you both, Emily and Dawne. And then I'm going to turn things over to Jamie to introduce our next presenters, who can go ahead and start sharing their screens as they'd like.
Oh, great. There we go. Thanks very much, Jessica. Our next presentation is